You've discovered the Techno Progressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high tech and radically democratic future. Donald Trump, OpenAI, and Bernie Sanders agree on something. Sit with that for a second because it should worry you and excite you in roughly equal measure. One wants the government stakes in AI companies because he wants his name on the deed to everything. One wants to buy regulatory freedom and federal buy-in with a high-profile bribe that can be spun politically. And one wants it because he thinks the deed belongs to all of us already. Same instrument, but very different politics. The debate over AI nationalization isn't really about whether the state should own a piece of the machine. Nearly everyone across the spectrum agrees that it should, or already does through equity stakes and procurement and R&D subsidies. The real fight is over what kind of ownership, governed by whom, and toward what end. A sovereign wealth fund that pays dividends, a nationalization that redirects surplus into public goods, an ad hoc portfolio of golden shares run out of the Oval Office, or an institutionalized, individualized, basic capital scheme that never asks anyone to act collectively at all. Welcome, Matteo.
Thanks, James. It's good to be here.
So this is a surprising pass for two lefties like us because we have been in the trenches for a while arguing for democratic socialism, but finally we have an administration who is just creating purportedly democratic socialist instruments left and right, forcing companies to partially nationalize themselves, Intel 10% and US Steel, a golden share, a dozen other companies, and also has directed the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. So now that Bernie has entered the picture with his proposal, we need to talk about that and how it relates to Trump, what Trump is doing, and why OpenAI and companies like OpenAI are advocating for partial nationalization or giving away ownership to the state. What's your first take on why we're at this impasse, this sudden socialist turn of public policy?
Yeah, I don't know if I would call what Trump is doing socialist exactly. I mean, a lot of the classical fascist governments did a lot of nationalization as well. And, you know, I'm not saying that Trump is exactly like the Nazi Party, but we could say it's a form of national socialism. And, you know, minus some of the more extreme takes on that front. But I would say that a lot of this is likely because the development of AI in this present phase, AI is not new, but in the LLM phase since 2022 has been is now becoming quite unstable. So, and I think that we're seeing a lot of companies and especially OpenAI, which has been going through a lot of internal problems, trying to reach profitability. XAI is, shedding billions of dollars every year in revenue, and there's really no path to profitability for most of these companies. And they're spending enormous amounts of capital, and, you know, they're highly over leveraged. So, yeah, they're looking for a way to stabilize their investments, I think, and to try and figure out how they can get into a better position that will enable some insulation as well from the growing tide of popular anger. And they would also, I believe, like to have a federal backstop if there is a crash, which may or may not happen. It depends on how industrial policy is carried out. A crash, in theory, could be avoided, but continuing to over leverage indefinitely unless gains are completely unprecedented, which they claim they will be, but it's yet to be seen, is almost inevitable. We will eventually have a bubble popping unless productivity and wealth increase beyond anything that's happened in the last 100 years.
Yeah, I think that the timing of a bubble is clearly relevant here because we're getting closer to whatever the pop is going to be. And I think all the firms realize that they are at the too big to fail stage, and they're trying to create the pretext for government investment. Now, they don't necessarily have to give over ownership stakes the way OpenAI is proposed, but they definitely want the government to step in and stabilize whatever happens in the wake of a bubble. I think that's pretty important, don't you?
I do think that's very important. And, it's not the first time we've seen this. It happened with the railroads. It's happened in many other cases. Electricity, they were massive bubbles in both of those. And this is even bigger. I mean, it's in real terms as well, in real terms, it's way bigger.
Half of all of last year's economic growth was the building of AI data centers and AI capacities.
Yeah, I don't have the figures on hand as how much of the national product was invested in railroads. It was quite a bit, but you know, the instability that was caused by the build out of railroads was quite extreme, and it caused many depressions, panics, runs, all of this instability. And the government did a number of things to stabilize it, first in the acquisition of land and later on in industrial policy and backstopping the um, the rail industry because it was a matter of national security. They needed to use the rail system for the delivery of troops and for maintaining the military. They needed it for maintaining the entire productive economy because it was the backbone of land-based shipping and still is the backbone of land shipping. A lot of products still travel by rail, even though trucking is obviously also quite significant. So, they didn't want extreme instability in these things. The government didn't want it, and obviously the rail companies didn't want it, so they produced these national monopolies. And they're technically utilities, but they're also monopolies. And now, even now that there's several rail monopolies, um, many of these rail companies are arguing that we should actually just have one monopoly. And that's not exactly what is happening in AI, but considering what AI companies are claiming, that it will be basically the backbone of the entire labor economy, it would significantly dwarf the national and international importance of AI as a strategic industry. It's clearly important in terms of war, and so it has a national security purpose in that regard. It could also be considered highly important for a number of other industries. And if it was able to automate large amounts of labor, it would effectively be the backbone of the productive system. So
So,
not
so,
having it stable would be disastrous.
So yeah, as you mentioned, the argument for having a national utility or nationalizing something is strongest when it's a monopoly, a natural monopoly. So electricity, early telephone wires, railroads, they were all things where you didn't want to have 20 different competing systems crisscrossing the country. You wanted to have the government say, you get to do it in this area and you get to do it in that area. And then we're going to oversee, because you're a monopoly, we're going to oversee how much you charge for what you're doing and we're going to regulate you pretty tightly. But you do get to, under different models of utility, you still get private profits out of that. You can invest in that public utility and get private profits out. Some models of utilities you can't. Um, so that's one argument. But as you say, I don't think we're in that situation with AI because especially with Chinese AIs nipping at the heels every 2 months behind whatever the frontier models are doing. We've got cheap open source models coming that will compete well with whatever's out there. And we have a competition between the frontier models as well. So we're not in a natural monopoly. So it's like, do you want to nationalize and subsidize McDonald's just because it's the most common of the fast food chains when there's a million other fast food chains? No. But Then the second argument is it's built on all of our labor. Dustin Guastella's argument article really highlights that argument. Bernie has been beating that argument. These models took the collective labor of mankind, and instead of all of us trying to figure out, well, you used, 1 penny's worth of my writing and some of my sketches for your model, the best way to do this is to say we all own it to some extent. We all should get dividends back. So I think that's the strongest argument right now with AI. And then there's as you also mentioned, the national security and global competitiveness argument. And just to remind ourselves, Biden wanted to uh, protect America's artificial intelligence capacity. He had the CHIPS Act. He wanted to reshore chip production from vulnerable Taiwan to the United States and was trying to subsidize that. Trump blew all that up. The tech right didn't want any government interference at all until the national security argument 2 months ago or 3 months ago kicked off, which is like, oh my God, you're building stuff that could actually destabilize every computer system in the world. So of course the government needs to control it. And then they started banning models and requiring prior approval like Biden had wanted. So there's that argument as well, that kind of whether that argues for nationalization or just strict regulation, who knows. But so there's a bunch of different arguments in play.
Yeah, I'm for sure. I totally agree with Dustin, who's he's a Teamster. He's very good. I think he does like what is it, the Institute for Working Class Research? I think
Mhm.
so he does really good research, and he's very in line with Bernie's argument, which I think is just on its face true. Like the models are built on our collective knowledge. Now, obviously, there's some innovation that happens under the umbrella of these various companies that allows LLMs to work. And it's quite a miraculous technology. Now, I think it's presently underperforming what it could do and be applied to, but it does some things quite well, and it has a potential, I think, to transform various industries. They claim all industries and all labor all the time, and I don't know, that's a huge claim. That's yet to be seen. But nonetheless, I think the moral argument and the moral claim, which is really a labor claim, that the social labor of humankind and the collective knowledge that was produced through that labor is the engine of AI is true. And I don't know how you could argue otherwise. It is based on all of the books and writings and music and art, et cetera, et cetera. And not just that, but also the technical manuals and guides and observations of labor that is occurring in various sectors. And so it's very similar to the way, Frederick Taylor studied the productive system at the end of the 19th century. And he had teams of people going to factories and warehouses and studying. He did a lot of what was called time and motion studies. And he did a lot of studies of how each individual worker was using their hands, how they were moving their bodies around the factory, where were they positioned on the assembly line. And he used all of that to try and figure out the most efficient way to lay out a factory, in the most efficient way to lay out the productive system. What different parts of the productive system should go together in which ways. And they called that the productivity revolution. It's also called Taylorism, which is highly critiqued by the labor movement because of the ways in which it de-skilled workers and broke up tasks, produced a lot of monotony, produced,
He famously said he wanted to break jobs down so that even a monkey could do them.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that, and that is something that has happened. There has been a vast de-skilling of various industries, and there has been also the hyper specialization of various fields. There's been some reversal of that in some fields, but we tend to see in almost every field, the newer it is and the more it's protected by credentialing, the more general it is. And the as it develops and as it becomes free of credentialing, it becomes more de-skilled over time. And usually like various parts of a credentialed, segment, like a guild, you might call it even, gets broken off, and then a less credentialed part gets created, and then it continues to break away, and more things fall away from what is considered needing to be credentialed, and then those things get automated until eventually, like, you have a situation in which people are credentialed, but they're only there for liability purposes, right? And my wife has noted that in the pharmacy in a pharmacy, especially in retail pharmacy. More and more it moves from producing medication to just overseeing the process. And why do we need pharmacists still? Because if something goes wrong, somebody has to be blamed. That's the way the system is set up. And it's the same with airline pilots. They don't
Yeah.
really fly like 90% of the time. They're just watching the instruments. But if the plane crashes, somebody has to be blamed. The airline's going to get blamed. They're going to blame this a certain pilot, and there has to be a chain. There has to be a chain of humans, and we see the same thing in the critique of the military. Well, we could automate technically like drones, but what happens when a school gets bombed? Who's going to get blamed for that?
You,
This is
you
like
know,
a
it's
present day problem, right? In the
that
Iran
that
war.
that's an interesting point because a lot of the pushback from the technological unemployment discussion right now mentions the fact that a lot of firms have been rehiring workers. I mean, part of that is that the tokens themselves became too expensive, or at least doing it with non-Chinese open source models became too expensive. Doing it with, with Claude or OpenAI. But part of it also is that they began to realize that they had automated all the workers in a particular sector, and they still needed some of them to oversee and check the work of the
Yes.
robots, and to take the blame, as you point out. Now, taking the blame might take longer, but checking the work, it strikes me that that is something that is probably a year or two for each job. You implement an automated system, and then yes, you need to keep some of the workers around to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. But once you figure out that it's doing what it's supposed to do, you can get rid of those workers too. So I do think it's kind of ironic that we're in that situation where people are saying, aha, look, we still need humans. So it's like, yeah, you need the last people before you turn out the lights. That's what you need.
Well, I was just saying this to David Wood on his podcast, London Futurists, and we were just talking about this very thing. And I do think that it's so much easier to automate. And again, this is theoretical, right? Presently, we don't have significant automation that has taken away like a significant share of jobs.
Yeah.
I forget the exact numbers, but it is
Very,
relatively small.
very localized evidence of technological unemployment so far.
But let's just say that Silicon Valley is correct. And there's a bunch of different problems that are baked into the assumptions of how many jobs can be taken and how quickly. One of the problems comes in a model or tech or like a robotic system or whatever. There's on the one hand the kind of nameplate capacity of what it can do, right? This is like a power plant. A power plant can produce X amount of power, but in reality, it often doesn't produce that much power because of uptime and because of various other things. It might only be producing 28% or 32% of what it could technically actually do. And that's even more pronounced in an intelligent system. Like in theory, a system can do a number of things and its power can vastly increase, but then it has to operate in the real world. So there are technical constraints that don't exist in the model before it's implemented. And then there are many technical constraints in implementation. And I don't just mean in setting up the system. That is one type of implementation. It's like, how do we go about, developing an industrial robot that can turn a screw? These are problems that GM, for instance, had in the 80s. They had all types of problems automating their factories. I mean, it's a great documentary. I can't remember the name of it right now, But you can look up the history of GM's automation, and they had all kinds of problems with doors being bolted shut and windows being put on backward, and all kinds of cascade failures that occurred. Now, those problems were eventually fixed. It took a long time and it was quite expensive, but they eventually fixed them. There's also the implementation problem of the technical implementation problem of a system has to work basically all the time, otherwise it's not fully automated. So one system might work really well, like, in an industrial system, putting the windshield on a car correctly, we can basically, okay, we get that 100% of the time. If it fails, we know, okay, maybe this robot is broken. We need to replace it or fix it. Okay, that's just one task. But every single task of building a car has to work. Preparing every single machine with another machine that also has to be maintained has to work 100% of the time, all the way from figuring out and discovering the principles of like metallurgy, like figuring out what you would say material science, element, particle physics, all these things that we need in order to figure out what materials are most efficient for various industrial applications, all the way to, doing an oil change on a car, paving a road, whatever, any number of literally everything a human can do or think, right? That's full automation. And it's very different to say that technically we know how to do all of these things with the machine system. Now, that's not actually true right now, but let's just say it's true in 2035, which
Mhm.
I think is optimistic, but let's just give into that proposal. It's very different to say that technically, right, like on paper, on the nameplate, we know and a machine can do a thing better, and a machine meaning both the physical machine and the software that runs it and the system, right? The whole network, in theory, can do all of these things. On the nameplate, it does all these things, but it has to do all these things in concert, in the entire system, the whole complex system has to function all the time. There's an enormous amount of labor that goes into reproduction of systems, right? Most of the labor that humans do is reproductive, right?
Yeah.
Mechanics, people cleaning floors, people fixing, houses, buildings, roads, you know,
Uh,
X, Y, and Z things, right?
I get it. I get the point. And I think we do need to be very cautious about our predictions of technological unemployment. Although even saying that certain kinds of occupations are still necessary and that we could automate these things, but the rest of the things can't be automated. That doesn't mean that everybody can migrate over to do those things very quickly. If you're a 50-year-old truck driver reskilling to be a computer programmer or whatever, which actually being a computer programmer is useless these days. But let's frame where the discussion here is about sovereign wealth funds, whether we should nationalize AI, how we should nationalize AI. And the connection to automation is that if there's widespread technological unemployment and automation, that would be one argument for why we need governmental oversight, regulation, perhaps ownership of these models, of these systems, in order to steer the course of how they're going to do this and how quickly they're going to do it. And in fact, my colleague Near, who I do the podcast Prosthetic Gods with, he says that his center right reason for supporting AI nationalization is that he thinks that nationalization slows everything down and that nationalized systems can't innovate. So he's perfectly content to see AI nationalized because he thinks that'd be the best thing for Luddites ever. But so that's one argument, is that we need that kind of control over the course of automation. And also on the other end, that we want some mechanism for funding the welfare state in general, and perhaps UBI in particular, on the other end of nationalization. And if nationalization produces, if automation produces lots of wealth and that goes up into these companies and into the pockets of trillionaires, we want to claw that back and put it into everybody's pocket. So that's the relationship to automation. But There's arguments for this other than automation, even if we don't have automation. So, as you mentioned, there's the national security argument. There's the possibility in the future of more natural monopolies coming out of these things, one big model to rule them all, or something like that. And I think you can argue for universal basic income on the grounds that it doesn't require automation in order to rationalize it. That it's a good idea in and of itself. So let's go back to the sovereign wealth fund for a second. Bernie's sovereign wealth fund is a proposal to levy a one-time tax on every AI company with gross profits over $200 million, which would be a lot of firms, even the smaller AI firms, and to get them to give 50% of their stocks to a national sovereign wealth fund, which would be governed by a democratic board, independent board. Of course, there's nothing independent now in the executive branch, according to the Supreme Court. But anyway, it would be governed by a board. Um, and the boards would have board seats and voting shares that would then control have some input into these companies. So that's one model. That's like the most democratic proposal out there. And then what Trump wants to do is just say he wants to create a sovereign wealth fund that he can start extorting companies to put profits into. So this is your reference to the fascists. He wants to reward his friends. He wants to put his name on things. He wants to say, I cut a deal for the American people and got you 10% of Intel. And we can be rightly suspicious of that. And then at the other extreme, I think, is the universal basic capital proposals, which I'm linking to this article from the Atlantic as well. And that's basically we give everybody an index fund of a little piece of everything that's on the in the stock market. And every American, and I think these are non-tradable shares, but at any rate, everybody gets the same little piece of the stock market, and it universalizes participation in the stock market, even though it doesn't, 10% of the people in the United States own 90% of the shares, and the bottom 50% of Americans, in terms of wealth, only own 1% of all shares. So redistributing stock ownership would have some positive effects and give people some dividends. It would also make us force everyone to participate in capitalism and think of themselves as mini capitalists, which could be bad as well. So between those three, I think we know which one you and I prefer. Are you suspicious of or hostile about universal basic capital as a proposal? And what do you think? Do you think that what Trump is doing now in terms of spot nationalization and the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, is that preparatory? Is that one step closer to what we want with Bernie's proposal?
Well, I think it really depends I think it really, I do agree that a sovereign wealth fund is a good idea in itself,
Mhm.
and that we really should already have one, and we probably should have had them for a very long time.
Lots of countries have them, and the Saudi and Gulf states ones are very big investors around the world, but of course dominated by royal aristocracies. And the Norwegian one is probably the most democratic socialist example. It owns 2/3 of the Norwegian wealth, the GDP. And it's mostly because it's natural resources. But go ahead. So sovereign wealth funds, great idea. US hasn't had one because in the past it was seen as socialist.
Yeah, we almost had them, but was defeated in the 1930s. But yeah, sovereign wealth funds are a good idea in general. Um, but it also really depends on what we're trying to do with our sovereign wealth fund. Like there are some more passive sovereign wealth funds, and then there are more active ones. The Saudi one is quite active. They do a lot of things with their fund. I believe the Norwegian one is relatively active as well. They do a lot of industrial policy from their fund. And we want to be active, but of course we want to make sure that we're active in the right way. And in terms of AI, why I was bringing up all those things about how the system works is that my main point was that it is so even in those really bullish cases on AI, it's so much easier to automate the first 90% than it is the last 10%. And there's and it depends on how long the transition is. And people say the transition is going to be like in 2 to 3 years, which I don't think is true. But the if there's it's likely to not be a super hard takeoff for a bunch of reasons, which I don't want to lay out in full here, but the transition really depends on very solid industrial policy. If we don't do industrial policy well, and there's mass unemployment and there's even a medium takeoff, it would be a social catastrophe. I mean, the likes of which we've never seen before. I mean, it would dwarf the Great Depression. And I don't know if civilization can, I think that could, I'm not saying it would cause us to go extinct, but it could be a civilizational catastrophe, like enough to collapse our global civilization. And I don't want to be hyperbolic in saying that, but there's just a number of ways in which people will not tolerate not having any income at all, not having, and having unemployment rates of 40, 50%, let alone 95%. I mean, it would be such a disaster that um, yeah, it's almost like beyond every horror movie to think about what it would be like to live in a world like that. And there's just no way that our society could sustain it. So we really want to have a policy that can use this sovereign wealth fund to shape policy in the right directions. And considering if it's kind of a bearish case and it's really the same old problems we've been dealing with, inequality, the oligarchy, new trillionaires being created, rising housing costs, which are all related to inequality and all related to the way the corporations act in society. It's a lot of it is an effect of the concentration of power and wealth, as well as a lot of often well-meaning policy at the local level to protect homeowners. For instance, when you have rising power and wealth concentration, there's the possibility of people coming in and using your town as just a way to sink capital into housing development. So people try to mitigate that by saying that you can't do that. And so they create zoning. And in some sense, that's well-meaning because it protects existing homeowners and various other things, but only by also increasing the cost of housing in general. So it's there are all those problems that we also could solve with a sovereign wealth fund, and we can solve by having proper industrial policy. But in the case of a mass unemployment situation, then the universal basic capital article that you were talking about, and also I believe it was in Dustin's article, but I can't remember exactly which one. The fact that we could have, you know, mass unemployment and concentrations of wealth that are already unprecedented, but like even more so, we could be having people with 10 trillion, $100 trillion net worths. This like would be totally absurd. And that would only create such an extreme problem, even if there wasn't mass unemployment. But if there was mass unemployment on top of that problem, like it would be so severe. So how do we deal with that? And some of what the sovereign wealth fund does is, of course, distribute wealth back to people. If we have 10x, 100x wealth,
Something it can do. It doesn't necessarily have to.
it could do. We could send dividends to people.
Yeah.
We could, use it to fund a UBI. We could do other
Bernie
things.
Bernie's proposal, the American Sovereign Wealth Fund proposal, he wants to basically create one that has $7 trillion of wealth in it, and that they would estimate it would generate enough dividends to send every American $1,000 check every year. Now, $1,000, that's I think there's general agreement that we're currently in the situation where substantial UBIs aren't possible. And so Musk keeps responding, "Oh, hold on and wait for universal high income. Don't try to go for universal basic income." Well, I want universal basic income in the event that this wealth takes off and we need to be distributing more later. But I want the camel's nose under the tent because part of the argument of universal basic income or universal ownership and provision in general is that it's sticky as public policy. And people, once everybody's getting a check, there's a kind of broad public support for that program, as opposed to means testing a program so only people under this amount of income get it. Then it becomes very unpolitically popular, unpopular politically. So at any rate, I think even $1,000 a year from an AI American sovereign wealth fund would be great for universal basic income. And then if these firms do blow up and blow up the economy and create lots of wealth for themselves, then we get to redistribute that as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I don't know that we can't do a substantial UBI now. I mean, I think it is possible, and but I do think it needs to be part of a concerted industrial policy. And I think that it is, on the one hand, if we if we just redistribute money like directly through like a stock program, that's one way of doing it. And I think that's not a bad thing. Of course, we want, and I do agree with the proposal that we could replace like the corporate tax on AI with a share of their stocks, and that would be both cheaper to implement and also less prone to tax evasion, less prone to offshoring and whatnot. And that it should be raised back to what it was just a few years ago, 35%. And so 35% of the stocks, in lieu of corporate tax would be very a good starting point. And we don't have to only charge corporate tax because we can combine it with like a land value tax for largely would, this would pertain largely to data centers, of course, not necessarily to like the buildings of OpenAI, which are a very small footprint. But it's also, companies also invest in real estate. They invest in all kinds of other things other than what they actually do. So there is a way in which you can draw wealth through the land that they can control. And a lot of companies do invest in land because they invest in real estate or they invest in financial companies that invest in real estate. And so there are ways to draw money out of that through a land value tax that would be much more progressive and also much cheaper to implement than the current taxation system. But the question then is like, how active should our industrial policy be? And if it's a disaster waiting for us, we need a very active industrial policy. If it's now it's debate, you might say it's debatable whether I'm correct in saying that the 90% is easier to automate than the last 10%, but I don't see automation happening evenly across all sectors all at the same time. And as we already know with existing data, there's a lot of ways in which spending substitution happens already. Like people already at the higher incomes spend their money very differently from people in lower incomes. And if there was a distribution of wealth and a change in the way in the if people had more time and more wealth, they would be spending their money very differently than if they have less time and less wealth. And that's true. So we would already see major structural changes in the economy. Now, I'm not saying I don't really buy the idea that everyone's going to become like, equivalent of a millionaire just because of AI, just because we have zero marginal cost production. There are just a number of reasons and a number of obstacles to that world, and we will not get there without industrial policy guiding it. There are all kinds of ways, for instance, in which companies could use intellectual property law to maintain very high profits and to keep people from gaining things based on the zero marginal cost. And you could say, well, there's of course going to be piracy, but then there would be an incentive for companies to invest huge amounts of money in authoritarian mechanisms, developing worse forms of government to prevent people from getting access to these things. And it could just spiral into a dystopia very quickly. So we need to have a lot of different moving parts. Like there's a lot of moving parts that need to be put into place in order to transition to a world in which there is a lot less of the labor that people are doing now. And, you know, that would be true. I do think that the last 10% will also go up in the number of people who are actually doing those jobs because of the level of complexity of an automated economy would and how even a 0.1% failure rate would require humans to know how to fix it. If the machines cannot figure out how to fix something even 0.1% of the time, it could cause cascade failures that could ripple across the whole globe and crash the economy. So only when we're 100% certain can we actually like remove humans totally from the loop of the economy. Presently, that's not the case. You can say, right? We could say with confidence, like systems fail all the time, and humans are not 100% capable in any given context of solving their own problems. But some humans somewhere are capable of solving these problems and have solved the various problems of systems failures up to this point. So, like,
Uh, okay,
don't want
but again, the automation question is separate from the sovereign wealth and UBI question.
what I'm
Uh,
saying is that we need to use the sovereign wealth fund and the industrial policy to solve these future problems.
yeah.
And this is already built into so Sam Altman's industrial policy proposals that he gave in April, we're already we need to have public models. We need to have various research into figuring out how to stabilize models, deal with any problems that might arise by implementing them. And any implementation is not going to be 100%. So then we're going to have to deal with those problems. And we need the government to kind of develop an ecosystem in which a lot of research and development goes into figuring out how to stabilize all these transitions. And let's just assume, based on what Silicon Valley says, that then if progress is increasing faster, that will that will compound the number of transitions, right? Like if it takes several years to change an industrial system today, like and it's only a marginal change often, whenever you want to retool a factory, what did Marx always say? Like capitalists have to revolutionize the means of production constantly. And presently that might be a decade or so in between these revolutions. I don't, maybe that's like a misnomer of the term, but according to the way that Silicon Valley narrates it, it will compress the time, which means that every single, might be every year, every 6 months, they're talking about completely revolutionizing the way we do things. New models, new productive systems to be more productive. And each one of those is going to require stabilization. So we need to invest in those ecosystems that can stabilize all these changes. Otherwise, again, what I'm saying is that in between each one of these changes, there could be cascade failures.
Mhm.
And if humans don't know where the problem happened because we haven't developed a kind of workforce that can I don't want to call it just it's not just a matter of looking over the shoulders of the machines, and being the night watchman. Like humans have to be able to be in the loop and understand these systems until such a time as every possible thing that a human could ever think or do is already done better by a machine, which is not presently how it works.
Okay, I agree that we need industrial policy. We need to have a sufficient regulatory control over the automation process so that it goes slowly and methodically and without screwing things up in the process. I don't know that there's a strong argument from that to say we need nationalization because we could. So, for instance, Asimoglu proposed that one of the changes we need to make in order to encourage labor, instead of automation, we need to encourage complementarity and labor extension. And he proposed that we tax capital investments as opposed to taxing investments in human labor, and that would preserve the profitability of human labor and make firms think more about how they're investing in capital and AI. Okay, that doesn't require nationalization. But the nationalization landscape that we're talking about runs from Bernie saying we want 50% ownership and control, and we want the federal government, as the representatives of the American people, to be directly participating in how this technology unfolds, versus Trump, who has in his policy no dividend mechanism for us getting actual checks out of the system. He just promises that it'll, like with his tariffs, it's like it's going to go into the general coffer and it'll make America rich or something like that. He has no proposal for how the sovereign wealth fund would be governed, or what kinds of managerial stakes they might play in the various firms that they co-own, and no real framing for industrial policy in that argument. And the universal basic compute is even less. It's just give everybody a little index fund, mutual fund, and there's no collective mechanism for intervention in the economy or collective decision making. So the arguments from Bernie to universal basic capital do represent a range of industrial policy choices. But I think we could have lots of industrial policy that would shape labor automation in the direction of labor automation without nationalization. So let's bring it back to nationalization for a second. I just want to mention the fact that Thomas Paine, one of the American revolutionaries, in 1797, in his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, he proposed that since the earth is the common property of the human race, that every American, when they turn 21, should get a piece of land. And so this was his basic universal capital argument. He also argued for annual pensions for the elderly. So the idea has been around for a long time that collective natural resources should be collectively owned and that we should all get a taste. And I think that that's a pretty strong argument on the nationalization side. It's not one that's been deployed very often or very successfully in the United States. And I think there's even a stronger argument for natural resources like oil, gas, those kinds of things, although those are pretty entrenched interests that we would have to fight. But getting those into a sovereign wealth fund, that's the way the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund was built, was the nationalization of before they had private investment in those areas. So at any rate, I think between these range of proposals, you have different industrial policy options. But let's put it steelman the opposition. So Dean Baker says, look, if we start nationalizing and having the American people get a taste of profit from specific companies and specific industries like AI, we're saying we as a country are invested in the future of AI, and we want to make it as profitable as possible. So how does that change the decision making about something like, do you want platforms to be maximally addictive? Well, if your dividend check every year is dependent on Facebook being maximally addictive, then maybe you do want Facebook to be maximally addictive, right? You want your fellow citizens to be gambling in this gambling pot so that you get a taste at the end of the year. And I think that that's some of the perverse incentives. Not only that, but also then we would have an incentive as a country to force the use, just like we did with military industrial complex and US aid in general, to force other countries to use our models and to undercut and ban the access to foreign models. And I think that would be a perverse set of incentives, right? So I think that, Michael Harrington said, any fool can nationalize something. The question is whether you can socialize it. So nationalization, as you said, it runs all the gamut from fascism to socialists, but it has, under different contexts, it has some really perverse consequences.
Well, that's very true. And what I was talking about wasn't exactly nationalization. I do agree. We don't have to nationalize AI companies per se to achieve a stabilization of artificial intelligence as an ecosystem. Like we could be, using this 35% shares in lieu of taxes to fund a sovereign wealth fund that also produces a set of national labs, or tax on to the existing national labs. There's a bunch here in New Mexico, and those could be dedicated to like figuring out how to deal with these various problems, both in safety and in terms of stabilization between various transitions. That's doesn't require nationalization. We could create a national or international kind of framework, but in some sense, that's really an utility. It's not quite the same as like the government directly controlling oil, for instance. And there's a reason why it's easier. It's just easier to control resources like those kind of resources than it is to control something like an AI company. I'm not saying there's no innovation involved. Of course, there's tons of innovation involved in drilling for oil. There's all kinds of ways in which they're constantly changing the drilling platforms, and there's lateral drilling and all kinds of offshore drilling and tanker projects. But it's
And I think the evidence shows that private incentives do extract more oil. If you want oil extracted, bringing in people who are going to make a profit off of it is actually usually more effective than state ownership. At least that's the lesson that people draw from places like Venezuela and so forth.
Yeah, there are some ways around that problem. Um, I do agree that, with the argument that, kind of civil servants are not going to be as large of risk takers as people who see risk taking as a means to profit. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's no path in which a public company could be highly innovative. I think there are many
Yeah.
ways in which they could be innovative. It wouldn't be the norm for America, but it's not like unprecedented in history. There's lots
No.
of ways in which public institutions have been very innovative. And the
I,
Stanford Research Institute is highly innovative and has been for a very long time and was extremely instrumental in the development of the digital world. Um, Various public institutions like MIT have been highly innovative. And there are many other examples around the world where innovation is possible if the incentives are correct. Now, it's not always easy to get the incentives correct, um, which is what his argument was. And I think that's especially true in regards to the Trump administration. So I do agree with that argument. Like if the if the incentives are that this is just like a slush fund that we're going to use to and it's going to be used to like determine who gets subsidies and who doesn't get subsidies, and that's all based on political favors. I think that does more follow the Venezuela model. Like I don't think that the failure of the oil industry in Venezuela is per se strictly a failure of nationalizing oil. I do think there are other ways in which the oil industry could have been nationalized and has been nationalized in other contexts that are much more effective
yeah.
and much more efficient.
I think what Trump has in mind is more like the Russian model, which is you give the certain oil industries to your friends, the Siloviki, the powerful men, and then they're part of your circle. They're politically loyal to you, and you favor their industries as a
Right.
state capitalist interest. Yeah, and the CCP does the same thing. I mean, there's certain Chinese firms that are loyal to the state and others that aren't. And if you fall out of line, you get your IPO canceled or whatever.
What you see just in those examples, like China's obviously doing a much better job than Russia,
Yeah.
like in many ways. Now, Russia still has a lot of oil, and I don't know. I'm not an expert in like, the efficiency of the oil industry, but we can see in terms of how the CCP has done its favoring of industries has been far more effective for national development than Russia.
and
Russia's
and
national
it
development.
has ruthless cutthroat competition in a lot of spheres, but for the biggest industries, it
Yeah.
is state capitalist. Yeah,
It's very controlled, for instance, for oil, for essential minerals. But again, there is a lot of innovation that goes into oil and essential minerals, but it's not comparable to the amount of innovation and what you would call the half-life of knowledge, right? the amount of time it takes for knowledge to become obsolete is much quicker in the AI industry than it is in oil. Now, maybe I don't, again, I'm not an expert in the oil industry, but I can imagine it's years to decades between major changes in how oil is extracted. And in AI, it could be a matter of months. So it's much harder to develop those industries, and you have to have extremely competent people in those industries in order to direct them in a way that is better than the existing system.
Right.
But
On that point, nationalizing AI right now might be like nationalizing VHS tapes in the mid 1990s or whatever. It's like yes, this was a very important technology for this moment, but next in the decade it's going to be something else entirely. And whatever you nationalize now, you're just slowing down that transition.
yeah, and we're just talking about LLMs right now. I mean, because most people, when they're talking about AI, they're specifically talking about LLMs. LLMs, according to Jan LeCun and some other people, are just bullshit, and they're going to be done in a few years. Now, again, I can't, I'm not, I don't know enough about this. You know, I've read many things that are on both sides of that argument, and I can't say where we should really fall because I'm not an expert in building AI models, but I do agree that it's not AI in general. And they're not really talking about expert systems. They're not talking about other ways of training models that are, presently not the dominant way that these very highly capitalized firms are doing it, right? Just like adding more and more compute is the thing that for a long time people thought would never work. And now it is working so far. Now, what again, past past success does not guarantee future success. Just because we've grown by thousands or millions of times in up to now does not mean we will continue on until the entire universe is a computer, right? To use like Ray Kurzweil's examples, like we're gonna have matryoshka brains where the whole planet-sized computers, and that's going to lead to models that are 10 to the 100th times more powerful than the ones we have now. Maybe. I just really cannot say.
By
But
the way, just on that, you remember the AI 2027 report that came out last year, and it
oh yeah,
was
only a few
uh,
months from 2027 now.
yeah, Kokotayo and some of these other guys, Romeo Dean and some of these other people. Anyway, they just released a new one called AI 2040, and you can find it at ai-2040.com, which is another detailed future scenario that takes us to 2035 and all the things that are going to happen. But it's still completely based on the notion that scaling up training data and the size of these models is going to generate artificial general intelligence, in 2030 or whatever. So I don't understand why the people in this futurist domain haven't caught up to the fact that scaling seems to have stalled. I mean, yes, we are making incremental progress, but I don't think we're getting, I generally agree with the people like, who's the guy, Gary Marcus, who says that we're not going to get to artificial general intelligence using just this scaling, that it's going to take some kind of continuous innovation from some other domain.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I can't give a prediction because I'm sure I'll be wrong, but I
Two
do
social
know
scientists talking about
there
computers, but
there's a lot of contention over the future of this existing um this existing iteration of AI. And again, it's not just AI. To do full automation, we are also relying on massive advancements in robotics, the drop in cost of robotics, and a variety of other systems that have to come together in order to automate the whole economy. Because I mean, right now we can only automate things that are manual or mental labor, and only to a point. So in order to automate the whole economy, we have to automate enormous amounts of physical labor as well. And we have to decouple any job, in which there are many, where mental and manual labor are in some way combined. That includes a lot of jobs. And that's theoretically possible, although not always socially possible or practical. And maybe again, it's possible in the future, but how far in the future, which is what gets to the transition question. And I think there are many good reasons why we want to develop sovereign wealth funds to deal with the problems of today, because we're already seeing a lot of negative effects from the high concentrations of power and wealth and the over leveraging of these companies. And so, but we don't want to. I agree that we don't want to make bets and be hitching our wagons, so to speak, to a very specific technological paradigm. And there are many ways in which we could, in some sense, produce a sovereign wealth fund that's much more distributed, which is what I would argue for. In some ways, right, Trump has already done some of this, although I don't agree with his reasons, and I think that he's not like a role model for us. But we should be thinking across the entire supply chain. There's there's all of the minerals that are needed to make computers and chips, and there's the data centers themselves, and there is the network infrastructure and architecture. There are the research laboratories. There's all the different stages in the supply chain and in the, you know, knowledge chain that are necessary to build AI, and they don't necessarily rely upon one particular narrow paradigm. So OpenAI, Anthropic, if they're so tied to one paradigm and then that paradigm goes bust, we don't want to be bailing them out
Right.
if they're on the wrong path.
Right. That's
So
the, well, what was the firm that Obama, there was a solar power firm, Solindra,
Solyndra.
that Obama set aside green money for, and we invested in this one firm, and it went bust, and that gave a black eye to the whole idea of American industrial policy. And people point out that China has invested state money in a variety of firms that have gone bust, but they also invested in things that didn't go bust and that turned out to be huge successes. So we just didn't persist long enough. But let's talk for a second about the distributional consequences of all of this. My preference for UBI would be that everybody, like a social security check, everybody get a check every month or every year
Mhm.
from the government that says this is what we have collectively decided all citizens should receive as UBI. That's my first preference. Next best for me would be something like Bernie's model, which is that there's this sovereign wealth fund. Hopefully, it includes natural resources as well as AI, but at least it gets the AI in there. Um, and it cuts a check to everybody that says, on the basis of this collective pot of stuff that the government owns on your behalf, and you get to manage it through democratic mechanisms, but you also get a check of dividends from it. Now that has the downside of making people feel like, okay, I have a personal stake in these particular companies being successful. So I actually more preferable than that would be an index fund. I'd prefer there be an index fund that, the government owns a little piece of everything and gets to, but then we wouldn't, unless we went fully socialist, we wouldn't have 50% ownership and be able to tell anybody what to do. It would be like 5% of everything. So 50% of the AI firms, okay, if we want to direct the future of AI, 50%, and then we all get a piece, but then we feel this personal investment. Trump's model has no distributional mechanisms, and then universal capital has this distribution that we get dividends, but we have no managerial rights and no claim to collective action in these firms, except. I mean, I suppose you could have universal basic capital. All Americans get organized around exercising their voting rights or whatever. But I don't understand the SEC well enough to how that would work. But so, do you agree with me at first that universal basic income ideally would not be tied to the success of particular firms?
I don't think the UBI needs to be tied to any specific firms at all. And
Yeah,
I think we can implement it today, and it doesn't require any future scenarios in which there are high amounts of unemployment. It's already necessary. It's been necessary for a long time.
yeah,
as has been the need for universal basic capital. And effectively, we already have the claim, of course, that land was not produced by anybody, but these companies and wealthy people, own huge amounts of land, and they didn't invent the land. They didn't create the land. And it is a kind of common inheritance of all people. I agree with Thomas Paine and many, Henry George and other people who have made that argument. And, their entire body of work, especially George, was based on that. And that's why he came up with the land value tax. But in terms of the, you know, human knowledge, that's also the collective inheritance of humankind, right? Of course, humans live on land. So, we need land and we need schools and all these factories and things. And where we develop our knowledge, we're all on land. But so we have both, right? We we have a clear moral claim to developing a land value tax, which just it doesn't really fund the UBI. If we understand how money really works in the American system, it doesn't really fund the UBI. It just removes purchasing power from the ultra wealthy. And because we want to always put a check on inflation, there's no purpose in increasing the amount of wealth given to people if prices keep going up. So to check prices and prevent, and especially with the land value tax, the inflation of housing cost and the inflation of food cost. So like those are directly tied to land. So that's why we have the land value tax. And this is why when we think about an industrial policy, it's also a social policy, which is why, techno progressivism is really good at thinking this way because we think of our technological advancement and development and progress as tied to social development, advancement and progress. How we should address these things together. So we have a good claim. It's a very justifiable claim, and there's lots of really great resources and strong arguments in favor of the land value tax. And in terms of, you know, removing, changing the corporate tax or the what, like in lieu of a wealth tax, we just where does all that wealth come from? Where does the value of a company come from? It comes from its stocks. And insofar as these companies are based on the collective knowledge of humankind, which is really indisputably true, then I'm not necessarily saying, although I would say it's much higher than 21 to 35%. The corporate tax rate in the last 20 years has fluctuated between those. But even if we were to say 35%, so 35% shares in all of these companies, which I think should also be extended, it's very hard to really decouple exactly like where the money comes from. But
Ironically, American corporate taxes are higher than most other OECD countries.
yeah, but they have higher taxes in other areas, which I
Right.
think is we don't want to increase sales tax. That's regressive. Um, Property tax should be replaced by land value tax because it incentivizes more construction,
The
and it
the, the Biden administration tried to get a global agreement on a 15% minimum corporate tax, which I thought was fantastic. That we've had the first shot at a transnational social democracy under Biden. But go ahead.
yeah, that's another thing because this is going to add a whole nother layer of complexity that maybe we don't want to get into right now. But human knowledge doesn't just come from America, where the AI companies are; it comes from everywhere. So we have to figure out some way to remunerate and not just again, we don't want to remunerate people only for their very specific, claims to a thing. Humankind operates as a social organism, right? Like it may be that some people invent an invention, but like how do we remunerate all the teachers that those people relied on, the people who maintained the roads that they needed to travel on? Right? This is the argument for socialism always, right? We can't really trace every possible little thing to give a property claim to every person. Like that's very hard to do. It's like basically impossible. So, and yet we all rely on so much social wealth and value to produce the things that we do, right? And I think it was, Leonardo da Vinci is the excellent example of this. What good is it to be, you know, the smartest man in your time if you don't have the capacity to realize anything that you create. It's just like you can create visions of helicopters and all these other things. You have to live in a time period in which it's possible to make those things. So, what does that rely on? It relies on countless innovations and also reproductions. You have to have people who you have to have people who are building the buildings that people are doing their discoveries in. They have to build the universities. They have to maintain the ground. Every day I come to University of New Mexico, I see people blowing the leaves and maintaining fixing the water lines and fixing the electric, fixing the Wi-Fi, you know, making sure that people aren't being assaulted and making sure that the library books are put back, making sure that the website is updated. And all that is invisible in the few cases in which somebody, you know, peeks their head above the water and invents something that people consider new. It's a collective endeavor, right? So
Yeah, I think you can acknowledge that,
that's what the sovereign
and
wealth fund is for.
I think you just on this point of innovation, and as I said, my colleague Near, he wants AI to slow down, so that's why he's in favor of automating it. And I have to confess that it is probably one of my most politically incorrect positions that automation, or rather that nationalization in general, does not encourage innovation, and that the competitive market does encourage innovation, and so. I think there, the classic example is AT&T, and it's more relevant here than other kinds of nationalization because we had a more or less government monopoly over who could make telephones. And then when we removed that, we got this huge explosion of all different kinds of phones and eventually cell phones and all different kinds of telecommunication devices. So um, if we want to slow down our AIification, there may be, and you are, even if you're a leftist and you agree that there's less innovation under state ownership, that would be one of the consequences. But I hear you saying that because innovation is collective, that maybe you're not, you don't think that nationalizing or partially nationalizing these firms would slow down their competitiveness?
Well, I think that these are two different things. Like what I'm saying is that we have a claim on the wealth produced by these industries because they are using our collective labor, knowledge, land, waterways. I mean, none of what they cannot function without these things. There's no way to get, resources from one part of the world to another without the shipping lanes.
Yeah.
Like that's a collective endeavor, which actually should be run by the UN and et cetera. We can talk all about that. Shouldn't be done by the US Navy, I think. But there's just no way. It doesn't matter if you have the smartest men in the room, like who are experts in AI. If you can't get the materials to make chips, there's no chips, there's no AI,
Yeah,
right?
but
And
look, we
multiply
can
that by
agree,
thousands.
but we can agree on that and say, look, if I'm Venezuela and I see that the state-owned energy company is only pumping 5 million barrels a day, but I think that if we bring in private oil companies, they could pump 50 million barrels a day, and we could get a piece of that. We would get the value of 10 million barrels a day out of that, even though most of the profits go to the private hands. Um, then you can make the argument that maybe we should privatize this particular industry because the collective benefit is going to be greater from, even though there's going to be private wealth generated, than when we try to keep this all in our public pocket. You can also say, the international private investors in wealth extraction through petrochemicals are more innovative, and they have the latest techniques for drilling or whatever, the latest techniques for LNG production or whatever. Um, and so we want to bring them in for that reason. So I think these are somewhat separable questions. You can make the argument that yes, we have a right to own and control these resources, this oil in the ground. But what's the best way to do it? Is it through state ownership or private ownership? That's been the economic debate.
Yeah, and I don't know that we need to have full nationalization
Mhm.
of these industries. Um, these are open questions. I am of the mind that why I'm a democratic socialist and not typically a Marxist-Leninist in the classical sense, or at least in the practical sense, is because I am primarily outcomes focused, right? Like I'm not basing my thinking here on like what is justifiable and what is ideologically true. I I do agree we have a claim and that we should find a way to, you know, use that claim in the most effective way that it will enable freedom for the most amount of people. So it's in some sense like I'm making both a moral claim on these resources and a utilitarian argument that we should be always thinking about what is best for people in terms of outcomes, not in terms of like what, like we can easily justify Venezuela's model based on ideology, and we would probably be correct. But that is not the same thing as saying we want people to have the most energy available to them because more energy available is better. It
Mhm.
leads to higher quality of life. It leads to a higher standard of living. And when we only base it on oil, of course, we only get one form of energy, and there are many ways to get energy, and there are many ways that we haven't yet invented. So we don't want to only be hitching our nationalization only to what is dominant at a given time, which is why it's better to have a sovereign wealth fund that's across many different industries. And where does the wealth get spent then? I think that really determines, and how is it a voting share or a non-voting share, which is the difference between Bernie's policy of AI and Trump's policy or the other policies that were mentioned of like having a 21 to 35% stake in the stocks of companies, which was non-voting shares,
Mhm.
right? And I don't even know that that's the most important question. I think the question is like, how do we spend the sovereign wealth fund? And we don't necessarily have to spend it on controlling AI companies, which we might be better off treating in a utility model that is not strictly a monopoly model because AI is not a natural monopoly the way a railroad is, or the way electricity is, or at least in terms of electricity lines like the grid, not necessarily power plants. We don't have to treat them as we don't have to nationalize them, but we could also have a mixture. We could say, well, we want to use some portion of our funds to create a national AI model or to give money to states to produce state models that are going to be used for particular purposes. We could use the fund for that as one of the things. We could say, like, okay, let's just say we achieve Medicare for all. Now, that can get into the argument again. You're for Medicare for all. That's a form of nationalization. It's going to produce public hospitals and clinics, et cetera.
Nationalizing insurance.
But also it's going to create public clinics, public hospitals, right?
It could be the basis for expanding them, but the Medicare for All proposals wouldn't propose the nationalization of hospitals or clinics, unlike the National Health Service in the UK. Anyway, yeah, I get
Yeah.
your point. Yeah.
But in order to plan it effectively, we could say, let's just as a proposal for what we could use a sovereign wealth fund for, and what would be both industrial policy and social policy, is to say like we as a nation want to have the healthiest people, right? Now, there are many ways, of course. Medicare for all is not the only way. There are many other things that we can do to maintain health, then we should also explore those. But insofar as we're considering sick care, when people get sick, we want them to get well as fast as possible. We want them to get the best care available based on what is presently limited resources. Ideally, Silicon Valley says we're going to have kind of unlimited growth. And so then maybe we won't have these problems anymore, but that's not the case right now. We have a limited number of doctors, nurses, hospital beds, et cetera. So if we want to administer the system effectively, we might want to create a national model and use that to administer parts of the Medicare for all system.
Mhm.
It's not going to administer every single part of the system. It's not going to automate all doctors, all nurses, et cetera. But it will enable us to figure out how to best allocate resources. And maybe this would be an augmentation. Maybe there would be various people who are systems experts that use these systems and produce simulations and figure out like how we can best allocate resources, or maybe how we can close the gap. Maybe, right now, for instance, there's a huge gap in rural healthcare. How do we close that gap? What's the best use of resources in order to close the rural healthcare gap? Maybe there are some models that maybe there are many different ways we can do it, and they all have different benefits and drawbacks. And so we can test them and we can use these AIs to test that. So we might want to have a specifically national model and an LLM that can like pull in all the data that is necessary and train that model to be as accurate as possible and as effective as possible in solving these problems for healthcare, or use it for medical research or any number of other things. And maybe we can have various public models, and those would compete with the private models, right? Now, of course, we don't want to say like Harvard could only use Harvard's model when they want to do research at Harvard, but we might want to produce public models that Harvard could say are better than what OpenAI produces, and that would produce a kind of public competition. And maybe the public model is better because it has less error, because it's trained in a better way, because it's not optimizing for the things that OpenAI is optimizing for. It's optimizing for research in a particular way that's beneficial for universities. So universities aren't spending, I don't know how much they spend on AI right now, but let's just say it could be billions of dollars in the future, maybe even more globally. And if we have these models, that might be a good use of funding. And if it turns out that those models are always consistently worse than the private models, people will probably, we will probably also have other ways of checking that. We would want to build that into the mechanism of how a sovereign wealth fund is organized and say, this is not a good allocation of funding. We want to do it a different way, right? And
I think that that's probably a good place to stop because I think there's a future conversation in what you just said.
that's kind of market socialism, I guess, in some sense, right?
Well, what it made me think about is that I think artificial intelligence systems are eventually going to be every organization and unit of society will have one that's dedicated as a kind of overseer or a system, hopefully interchangeable, won't be locked into them, but you'll have the IBM overseer AI that will know what's happening at a corporate level and be able to act in the corporation's interests or whatever. But if you had to, at the governmental level, just like the defense industry, they would need to be specially vetted to make sure that they were not smuggling in foreign interests and that not leaking government secrets and protecting citizens' rights and so forth. And
It's
so
not
there
secure.
were, yeah. So you would, I think that's another argument for potentially for nationalizing at least specific models to say we're going to have or having a utility model, at least for specific models, to say this one we're going to protect and we're going to put under special constraints so that it can be used in this collective way. But I think that's a conversation for the future. I want to just make a reading recommendation. My other reading group, the Altercockers group, which is a bunch of old DSA socialist folks, we're reading Nordic Socialism by Pelle Dragsted, who is a Danish lawmaker from the Red Green Coalition in Denmark. And the book basically makes the argument about all the different ways in which you can think about the transition from capitalism to socialism as a kind of spectrum of policy options, and makes the argument that Denmark is half socialist, or the Nordic economies are half socialist. And I think it's a very useful perspective for this particular conversation because you can say something like, okay, what Trump's doing is 20% socialist. What Bernie wants to do is 80% socialist. They're all on a spectrum, and maybe there's multiple paths to that thing. And
Yeah.
so let's leave it there for today. What are we doing this week or next week in our techno-progressive world building course?
We're going to read The Making of a Tech Worker Movement, And from there, we're going to study the tech workers movement and various different campaigns within it and discuss tech labor and the ways in which labor is an important lever for thinking about technological development and, just also to bring in last week to think about design justice and to think about how potentially we can steer progress, at least partially, not wholly, from within the tech industry itself through its workers.
Great. And you can reach Matteo if you would like to participate. It's open throughout the summer. We're meeting on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. EST, which is noon Mountain Time. And so you can contact Matteo at Matteo at iet.org. That email address does now work. And or me at director at iet.org. In the show notes, you'll find Dustin Costella's piece on nationalizing AI, Dean Baker's piece on why we shouldn't nationalize AI, Matt Brunig's defense of Bernie's proposal, and some other things. Thanks so much for joining us. You've been listening to Techno Progressive Hub.
Thanks, James.
The Techno Progressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Techno Progressive.